What is happening in Sudan? Sudan's army-backed government said on Sunday that it would not attend U.S.-sponsored peace talks due to get underway in Switzerland this week, reducing hopes of ending the civil war. A Sudanese government delegation held discussions over the weekend with the U.S. and Saudi Arabia's city of Jeddah regarding the invitation to the Geneva negotiations. However, it stopped short of closing the door on taking part in the negotiations to end 15 months of fighting between the army and the Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF. The government has sought assurances that discussions would focus on implementing the existing Jeddah Agreement, signed in May, to facilitate humanitarian action to meet the needs of civilians. It also said the government should be represented by all its components, not just the military, and rejected the participation of any new observers or facilitators. The U.S. has reportedly described the talks as primarily military in nature, aimed at achieving a ceasefire and facilitating humanitarian aid. The RSF has said it be take part in the Geneva talks. Previous peace agreements between the two sides have failed. Fighting in Sudan has claimed more than 15,000 lives and displaced some 11 million people. On the same grounds, let's look at the current trending news in South Sudan today. South Sudan is not ready to hold its first post-independence elections in December, and this have kept political players discussing whether voting should be held this year. The UN's top envoy in the troubled African country said Wednesday. Nicholas Haysom told the UN Security Council that the consultations make it difficult to treat the election date of December 22 announced last month by the National Elections Commission as a definitive trigger in isolation from other critical factors. The vote, which would be the first since South Sudan gained independence from Sudan in 2011 after a long conflict, is meant to be the culmination of a peace agreement signed 5 years ago to pull the world's newest nation out of a civil war largely based on ethnic divisions. Fighting between forces loyal to the current president, Salva Kiir, battled those loyal to the current vice president, Riek Machar, killing some 400,000 people. For better understanding of the current situation, I have some videos to show you. But before we watch the videos, kindly subscribe and like the video for more information.
On 9 July 2011, South Sudan held its formal independence ceremony in Juba, the capital, an event that marked a departure for Africa. While most African countries became independent on a negotiated transfer of power from a colonial authority to a new national elite, South Sudan's independence came from the directly expressed will of its people. The journey to independence for the people of South Sudan is a saga of resilience, determination, and unwavering hope. Spanning nearly 2 centuries from 1821 to 2011, this path was marked by relentless struggles and profound hardships. The people of South Sudan had endured oppressive colonial rule only to find themselves under the grip of radical Islamic regimes in Khartoum. Despite these challenges, the indomitable spirit of South Sudan's people remained unbroken. Their relentless pursuit of freedom and self-determination culminated in the historic independence ceremony on July 9, 2011. The history of South Sudan is deeply connected with that of the Republic of Sudan. Prior to the European scramble for Africa, the land now known as South Sudan did not exist as a unified country in the modern sense. Instead, the region was home to various small, medium, and large ethnic groups that coexisted in relative harmony. Sudan's diverse ethnic and religious groups were unified for the first time under a centralized administration during the Turco-Egyptian colonial rule, which lasted from 1820 to 1882. In the early years of the Turco-Egyptian rule, southern Sudan remained relatively isolated. However, by 1827, collaboration between the occupiers and northern Arab groups led to deeper penetration into the region, resulting in frequent raids for ivory and slaves. Some scholars have argued that northern Sudanese were complicit in slave trade practice through collaborating with the Turco-Egyptian rulers to sell southerners to Arab slave markets. Even before this occupation, southern Sudan was already a source of slaves and ivory. But under the Turco-Egyptian rule, the slave trade became a state-sanctioned activity, growing rampant and widespread, reaching deep into the south, the Nuba Mountains, and southern Darfur. The slave trade peaked in the late 19th century, with many southern Sudanese, primarily from the Dinka region, being enslaved and sold like cheap commodities by Arab, European, Egyptian, and Turkish traders. All this had the net effect of instilling and entrenching prejudices, stereotypes, mistrust, and hostilities that would characterize relations between the northerners, who were mostly black Africans. The Turco-Egyptian occupation ended in 1882 when the northern Sudanese revolted under the leadership of Mohammed Ahmed ibn al-Said Abdallah, who called himself the Mahdi. After the British occupied Egypt in 1882, they attempted to intervene militarily in Sudan, but they were unable to suppress the rise of the Mahdi. In 1885, Mahdist forces captured Khartoum, defeated the troops of the British General Charles Gordon, and established Sudan's first theocratic state using Islam as a unifying force. The rule of the Mahdi was equally brutal for the inhabitants of southern Sudan. The slave trade continued with even greater intensity, and Arabic and Islam were forcibly imposed on the south. In 1898, the Mahdist state was defeated by Anglo-Egyptian occupation forces. The following year, in 1899, the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium was established, allowing Sudan to be jointly administered by Egypt and Britain. However, despite the appearance of equal partnership, the British dominated the administration from the outset, effectively controlling the condominium. Within the first 2 decades, most of Sudan's borders were defined, and nearly all the territory of modern-day Sudan came under firm British control. Railroads were constructed to link key areas of economic interest and to control the Upper Nile along the White Nile. Schools were established in Khartoum and several major urban areas, catering primarily to the children of affluent families and colonial civil servants. During this period, nearly all economic infrastructure and development projects were concentrated in the agriculturally rich north-central region. In contrast, the South saw minimum investment in economic, social, and administrative structures. At this point, I need to state that Northern Sudan was heavily Arabized and had a fairly well-structured political and economic infrastructure. Northerners practiced Islam and were relatively well-educated. Meanwhile, Southern Sudan was mainly composed of various Nilotic tribes who practiced a mixture of Christian and traditional beliefs. In 1922, the British instituted a separate system for the southern region comprising the provinces of Equatoria, Bahr el Ghazal, and Upper Nile. These 3 provinces were administratively segregated and largely neglected in terms of social and economic development. The few social services available, such as schools and clinics, were predominantly provided by Christian missionaries. As a result, the southern region remained chronically underdeveloped in education, healthcare, and basic infrastructure. The colonial administration also instated a policy called the Southern Policy. Under this Southern Policy, nearly all relations between the northern and southern regions were cut. Northern Sudanese were barred by law from entering or residing in the south. Even long-term northern residents, especially Arab merchants, were forced to leave the south. Similarly, native southerners were prohibited from traveling to or seeking employment in the north. The spread of the Arabic language and Islam was restricted in the south, while Christianity and the English language were promoted. The whole purpose of the Southern Policy was to maintain Southern Sudan as a distinct entity from Northern Sudan. Reflecting this separation, colonial governors from Southern Sudan attended regular administrative conferences in East Africa rather than in Khartoum in the north. The separation of the South from the rest of Sudan and the imposition of a distinct administrative system served important British colonial interests. These interests included preventing the spread of Arab and Muslim influence, preparing the southern region for eventual integration with the British East African Federation, as well as controlling the sources along the Nile. However, by the 1930s and 1940s, as the issue of independence began to dominate political discourse, the British started to shift their stance. Pressured by a growing nationalist movement in the north, Britain reversed its southern policy roughly a decade before granting Sudan independence. They lifted all restrictions that had separated the southern region from the north and acceded to northern demands for a united Sudan. Movement between the two regions was permitted, allowing northerners to return to their administrative posts in the south. Arabic replaced English as the official language of administration in the south and was also introduced as a school subject. Additionally, the ban on Muslim preaching in the south was also lifted. During this period, as preparations were being made towards eventual independence for Sudan, a conference was held in Juba, the capital of Equatorial Province in the south, from June 12 to June 13, 1947. At this particular conference, the new One Sudan policy was forced upon the south by the British and supported by northerners. Southern chiefs, many of whom were uneducated, were pressured to endorse the conference resolutions at face value. The southern chiefs were assured that a post-independence government would give the South autonomy over its affairs. But unfortunately, as you see in this story, this never happened.